Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. Welcome to our guests and to the panel. My name is Karolina Skog and I am a member of Parliament in Sweden representing the Green Party. And we are hosting this webinar today together with the Swedish Association of Green Motorists. Today we will talk about eco-labels. The eco-labels are now required on all fuel disposers across Sweden. And this will make it easier for consumers to compare different types of fuel. This increases their possibility to make an informed choice regarding the type of fuels they use, and it will be important for consumer awareness on climate change. Even though electrification will play a crucial role in the future when reducing emissions from the transport sector, cars with combustion engines will be on the roads for quite some time. During this time, different types of fuels will serve as a bridge to the net zero goal. Therefore, it is important that drivers of cars can choose and have the opportunity to have the knowledge they need, knowledge on raw materials and origin, and of course on environmental impacts. And these eco-labels will make it easier to make informed choices. With this, I want to say welcome again and hand over to the moderator today, Östborn.
Thank you, Karolina. So we will first have a series of presentations and then a panel discussion. And in the first two presentations, we focus on the new Swedish eco-labels that Karolina described. And our first speaker is Jakob Lagercrantz, and Jakob is the CEO of the Swedish 2030 Secretariat. And that's an NGO committed to the decarbonization of the transport sector. And they gather a coalition of the willing, mostly among companies. And until 2013, Jakob was chairman of the Swedish Association of Green Motorists. And before that, he was executive director of Greenpeace Sweden. And actually, Jakob planted seeds to the eco-labels that we now see at Swedish gas stations. We are happy to have you with us today, Jakob, and we look forward to hear your thoughts and maybe some remembrances. So please, Jakob, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Per, and thank you, Karolina, for inviting me to this seminar. Actually, it started, I think the first time we mentioned labeling the fuel was in 2007 when I dig down into my archives on the computer and actually see when did we first discuss this. But then I left, and it's all thanks to you and a few other people that Gröna Bilister was able to do this. And to get the response from two ministers in the Swedish government, Karolina and her colleague Per, from the same party, who actually were brave enough to push this through as I gather one of the first, if not the first, eco-label on fuels in the world. There has been other initiatives, and we'll hear much more about them later on. I have a few slides, not to make this a very long presentation, but let me just go through a little bit about the developments, because this is really exciting. Having an eco-label is a dynamic power. It can mean so much change. And it actually started already in the 1860s. The first ethical labeling was done by this book, in a way, started a whole initiative in Holland, where the author, Edward Douws Dekker, actually, he was a disgruntled civil servant, and he was pissed off at the Dutch government and the fact that they didn't really care for the workers' condition in the Dutch East Indies. And by writing this book, he actually got people in Holland to start caring about the working conditions for people in the East Indies. And he actually made a change through making a book. And that was the first ethical. It later became actually an eco-label or an ethical label for coffee in Holland. I think what drives change is pressure, of course. It could be market pressure. It could be NGOs political decisions, in some cases innovation, even research. It needs to be combined with external events. Actually, that the environment is becoming an important issue. We could have environmental disasters like we had before what we thought was an environmental disaster that was actually overfishing, and that was the so-called seal death in Sweden that got really a large environmental debate going. Then it turned out it was probably overfishing and the virus that was the reason behind this, but it got the discussion going. And you need those events to actually get the change. And you need some kind of awareness in the public. I think that is very important. And you see my photograph down in the right-hand corner. Who would have thought that we could ban smoking in pubs in the UK, in Sweden, in Denmark? And that was a combination of all these things. And I think it just shows that the most incredible things could actually be done. There are several hundred eco-labels in the world right now. I'm just showing the EU one here. We have a World Eco-Label Day. They are all not equal. Some of these eco-labels are done by companies. They're not really to be trusted because they are not reviewed by a third party, but many of them are extremely good and actually show people, give them a direction on what to do or what not to do. And I think that is very important when you are a buyer. The consumer power comes from us having the information to actually choose. And I think that is the whole core of the issue. I'll give you 3 examples of some really interesting eco-labeling or event developments. The first one is coffee filters. I was working in Greenpeace in those days, and we heard at the national radio broadcast, the news broadcast in the morning, that they had found traces of chemicals coming from the dioxin family in white chlorine bleached coffee filters. And that was all over the news. And most of us drink coffee. We drink a lot in Sweden. And I remember talking to people in those days and saying, do you really want to drink coffee that has filtered through a chlorine bleached coffee filter with trace material from dioxins in it? And of course, people said no. And they all over one night started buying these brown, non-bleached coffee filters. So of course, it doesn't really matter. The coffee filter will go brown anyway after you use it. And that was the beginning of the eco-labeling period, with the 2 largest eco-labeling systems in Sweden coming in 88 and 90. We had the TCO labeling on screens. That was both a work health issue and an environmental issue. The TCO label came from basically one person at one union in Sweden and became worldwide known. And it started small, but it found awareness in people, and there was a need to actually get it done. And now the third example is this wonderful eco-labeling on the pumps, where you make it obvious to the person fueling the car that you actually can make an impact by choosing maybe another station or choosing another fuel. And I think it's so important to give people power, the chance to do this. I think, in a way, fuels is the most difficult area to get into. It's almost an holy area where people have very strong feelings. I often call it a minefield of different points of view. But as we see from the eco-labeling system we now see on the fueling pumps, it's all about life cycle perspective. It's based on the European, what has been agreed in the Renewable Energy Directive. So it is the best figures that we could actually get. They could always be improved, but that is the next step, and next step. Fuels are perceived as really complex. It's hard to say, and we don't know. And it has, as I said, become emotional, and people say, well, I refuse to deal with that fuel, and that fuel leads to starvation. Well, no, it doesn't. There are pretty straightforward figures on all the fuels that we use in the world today, and we know that some are good and some are really bad, and that has to be shown on the pump. And this cannot be done by an organization, the company itself, or anybody else. It has to be done by independent, a trustworthy organization. And in Sweden, the figures all come from the Swedish Energy Agency, which is, of course, above suspicion, or it should be. No, it is. It's a really good agency, and they do some really hard work in cataloging all the fuels coming onto the Swedish market. Also, it has to be easy to understand, and I love these colors and showing where on the scale the fuel is, because that is what it's all about. And of course, the production of it has to be transparent. This should not be a secret or any protected ways to deal with things. It should be totally transparent. I would say that eco-labeling is key. If we don't have an eco-labeling, if we don't have the information to the people, then we don't have people power. And when we have people power, we can really make a change. So as my final slide, I just want to say hats off, champagne in the glass. Congratulations to Gröna Bilister, to ministers and former ministers, Karolina, and all others who have worked with this, and maybe most of all to Per Östborn, today's moderator. It's not by chance he's the moderator. He has worked so hard on this, and I stole a quote from him that he has never said, but he could have said it. This is a small step for Sweden, but a giant leap for the transport industry. Thank you very much.
Thanks for a very inspiring speech, Jakob, as usual. I have one small question to you. You work closely with companies in your everyday job, and with some fuel companies as well. What do you say have been their reactions mostly to these eco-labels?
Well, on average, because there has been one that was kind of negative, but average, they have been quite straightforward in saying, oh, we don't really like how this is done, but sure, it needs to get done. There has been a long dialogue on it. There has been some heated words, but after a while, they say, well, fine, because we know that we need to discuss with the customer one way or the other. We would have chosen maybe another way to do this. But all in all, let's see how this works and improve it year by year, because everything can be improved. It's all how the data is generated, how quickly it's done, and so on. So overall, I would say that they are by now, they've agreed to it. Let's do it, and because many of them are actually contributing to the decarbonization of the transport sector.
Yes, thank you again, Jakob. So our next speaker is again Karolina Skog, the return of Karolina. And you introduced yourself, but just a quick reiteration. Karolina is a member of the Swedish Parliament for the Green Party, and currently she is the spokesperson for economy. But from 2016 to 2019, Karolina was Minister for the Environment. And it was in that role she passed the Swedish eco-labeling bill. So she is the main reason why we are here today. And we are very eager to hear you speak, Karolina, about the eco-labels, and maybe some words about the political process that led to them. So go ahead, Karolina.
Thank you, Per. And I will try to share my screen first. And my presentation. So, and I'm very, very glad to have the opportunity to do this seminar tonight together with the Green Motorists, because I want to start my story on how these labels came about with celebrating the who should be celebrated, because the idea of the label came from the Green Motorists, and they are small, but I would say very efficient NGO. Very knowledgeable and very trustworthy. But I also want to put the context, especially for you international viewers. Back in 2016 and 18, from the 17 and 18, the Swedish government worked a lot with fuel issues. We had a market with biofuels coming in, but it was very unmature and needed to be regulated. And we struggled with the regulations also from the European Union, where some of the biofuels produced in Sweden had a hard time reaching up for the standards, and a lot of discussions on taxation. In that period, we created a reduction scheme, which means that, which is a bill, where everybody selling fuels is now forced to put on a part of the fuel as biofuels to reduce the CO2 impact of its fuel. And in that period, of course, that generated a very needed discussion on biofuels, on the sustainability of different kinds of biofuels. And that in that period, it was needed to clarify that biofuel is not the same thing. Some are sustainable, some is not. And then we needed a tool to make this straightforward and get the information out to the consumers. And here, Green Motorists came with their idea on green labels, and it was really timely that we could work parallel with a bill on biofuels and a bill on labels, because they work perfectly together. As a minister, I could work very closely with an energy agency and with Green Motorists to figure this out. And the fuel industry was also open for this discussion, since they supported the new bill on biofuels. They were not happy. They had quite a lot of arguments against the labels, but as Jakob said, they sort of realized that this is going to happen, we might as well go along with it. And one key issue was that we listened to the companies in one regard, and that was that we are using existing information when making up the framework for the labels. So there's no new administration pushed on the companies. It's information that they have to give to the energy agency anyhow, and it's used by the agency to create the labels. That was one of the key to get the companies on board. So now let's take a look what it looks like on the fuels, on the gas pumps. Here you see the labels. To your left you see the generic version made by the agency, and to the right the label that I found yesterday when I was out with my gas car to get it refueled. And I get biogas to my car, and then you see that is on the green side with a low CO2 impact. And to get a closer look, we can zoom in.
Excuse me, Karolina, we are not seeing the slides, the labels.
You don't see the slides?
No. You have to push the presenter button.
I have to push, so I've been talking without. Sorry. Choose the application. Sorry. Why I'm not? I'm doing something. Tove, can you help me out? I'm doing something wrong. I thought. I keep talking, and I hope Tove will help me to get the slides out so you can see a picture of the label. Because I only have them. Yeah. So the label, I will try to describe it and see if Tove can get the presentation on. Because I can't do it, Tove. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Okej. Så nu Tove, testa igen. Nu har jag gått ner. So at the gas pump, there is a label And so I'll try to explain it, and I hope you will get the picture out soon. One part is a scale, where you have red on one corner and green on the other corner and yellow in the middle. And each fuel will get a mark on this scale, either green, which is good, yellow, half good, or red, which is bad. This is based a CO2 scale. So we had to choose one parameter, and we chose CO2. Below this, there is information on which raw material is used on this specific fuel. And there's two websites on the label. One is the website of the company. On this website, they are to present the country of origin of the fuel. We thought we could have the country of origins on the label itself, but the EU Commission did not agree with us on that point. So that is the information is placed on an internet side. You also get the link, the information on where to find more information at the Energy Agency's website. So exactly now we're getting is gå till bilden om here, exactly. So here you see the label, and you go to the next slide. We can get the details out. Exactly. On the top, you have a year, which was very important for the companies because they want to know which year this was about so that they can get the correct information. Product name, link to the information, of more information, and then the scale with green or red. And this is the same scale which is used, for example, on refrigerators. So it's known to customers. Where to measure environmental impact on this scale. So we wanted to use something that was known to customers. Next picture. Here you will see in percentage which raw materials are used in this particular fuel. And again, year. And my last slide is a wish. Because of course now Sweden was the first country in the world putting these labels out, and in collaboration with the government and an NGO. But now we want to spread the word around the globe, hope to inspire other countries. I've had the opportunity to present this idea to Mrs. Schwarzenegger, who's a keen climate activist. And I hope that this message will go on and inspire more cities and more countries around the world. Thank you. Micken.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Karolina. We are very happy to hear the history behind these labels, and we're happy that you finally got to show us the labels. And I asked Jakob about the reaction from the companies, and I'm curious to ask you if you can go backstage, the political backstage. What was the most common reactions from your political colleagues and opponents when you presented this idea? Were they interested, disinterested, or did they oppose the idea mostly?
The interest has not been very great on the political sphere, and many of my colleagues thought this was impossible due to very practical reasons, because they listened to the industry, which presented a lot of practical issues that could make it. It's not possible due to this or that, and it's complicated. So I think the debate was very practical and not at all ideological, and nobody opposed the idea, but they thought it would be difficult to implement. And therefore not realistic.
I see, Karolina. Interesting. So thank you again. And now that we have learned about the new Swedish eco-labels, we turn to similar initiatives in other countries. And just like Sweden is the first country with mandatory eco-labels on gas pumps, Cambridge, Massachusetts, is the world's first city with mandatory climate change and health warning labels on gas pumps. And Patricia Nolan passed this ordinance as member of the city council. And the labels were up just before New Year's Eve, I think. So, Patricia, we are honored to have you with us today and would like to hear about the warming labels in Cambridge and how they came to be. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. What I want to do is have those labels on that Karolina showed on refrigerators and others across our entire spectrum of appliances, since our labels are not nearly as specific and don't yet include the raw materials going in, which is just what many of us are moving towards, is just a raw categorization of energy use. So I am going to try to bring that back and see if we can do more here. Onto the gas pump labels. What I'll talk about a little bit is the context for which this was brought forward to Cambridge. As we all know, these kinds of initiatives can take a long, long time. This was first proposed, speaking of former Governor Schwarzenegger, Karolina, that you met, in California on the West Coast, several cities on the West Coast in the United States, Berkeley, Seattle, and then in Canada, in Vancouver, sought in, at least what I know of, and starting in 2014, led by some climate activists involved with the organization 350, particularly Jamie Brooks, to say, let's get this passed. It was passed at the local level in several places, and then apparently was never actually implemented, that it was stopped after, even though the city council wanted it, it was stopped there. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, we heard about these efforts. It was brought to the city council. I was not on the city council then, but I was certainly aware of it as a person involved in climate and involved in local politics. And in June of 2016, it was brought to our city council, asking us to look into it. We had to then preview it with our lawyer. I'd be interested to know if other efforts had to do that as well. Our lawyer was asked to weigh in on, can we do this? There's so many litigious situations in the United States. And lo and behold, our lawyer, who was usually incredibly, conservative and doesn't let us do things, came back with an opinion saying, yes. What's interesting for those of you, if anyone is listening in the United States, the issues that were raised were First Amendment. Does this violate First Amendment speech rights for the gas owners to say what they think about it? Does this violate the United States Federal Commerce Clause? Is this preempted by any federal or state laws? I mean, it's a pretty extensive legal memo. It's a public document. Happy to send it to anywhere in the country. It's specific to both national and federal law as well as state law. She came back and said, in fact, yes, we can do this based on, as long as it's objective information based on scientific evidence. What I can't explain is why it took from that legal memo, which was presented to the council in October of 2016, to why it took a full 2.5 years for it to come back to the council in a specific order to say, all right, the legal opinion is clear. Let's then put it into our local law. That effort was then, actually it was almost 3 years. It was not until October of 2019 that the city council then brought it back, said, let's do it, and basically formulated language so that it would become a local law, that this was required on gas pump labels. That finally did pass in actually January of 2020. And once again, I will say local government is interesting. I had voted for it and then realized, again, from activists saying, wait, you passed this 6 months ago. Where are the labels? Finally, they're on. It's incredibly exciting. They are bright. I could share my screen or you can look it up. They are bright yellow labels with red warning. And it really, I think I want to reiterate that this happened because activists brought it to councilors. Even those of us who are involved in climate issues, these are the kinds of initiatives that might be small, but maybe not raised to the level of something that a city council or a local elected official might take on. So it's critically important to have that connection with activists. As Karolina, you explained, you worked a lot with activists throughout the country to make it happen at a state level. And the questions that we get sometimes is, does this actually matter? Well, as Jakob explained, labels matter. Well, certainly in the United States, cigarette labels have been on for a long, long time. Did it prevent anyone from smoking? It didn't prevent my parents from smoking, but I'll tell you, it made all of their kids, my sisters and I, look at that label and say, stop smoking. It has an impact eventually. It's something we need to do. I will quickly say that our label was generated from two very clear senses of the urgency and the immediacy. And that was both the public health threat and the climate change threat. So both of those, they're intimately tied, but they are both on the label. The language is pretty simple. It says burning gasoline, diesel, and ethanol has major consequences on human health and on the environment, including contributions to climate change. So it's pretty simple, it's pretty clear, but it definitely mentions, I know there's been some discussion about whether public health is mentioned in other labels. This is very specific that it is both of those. And part of our discussion on council was also that this is a matter of consumer education. Believe it or not, it's just a reminder for every single person, every single time they go to fill up, that this is something they are literally, they themselves individually, while it's all the companies and the corporations are providing these products, every single time a consumer makes a choice to buy a product, let's remind them that this is contributing to negative and adverse implications for public health and for our climate and our planet. And in relation to those, equity is a strong component also. This is something in our country and around the world we're seeing. It's frontline communities, it's low income people, it's folks who have no other resources who are most harmed on both of those scales by climate change and also the adverse impact of climate change, of asthma in rates. You know, the cars that are spewing throughout our city and our entire metropolitan area concentrate where the highways are, where low income people are. It had the impact on public health on COVID. We saw the rates of COVID directly tied to where it is that cars were in most abundance and we're going through our cities. So I'm very glad that we are the first, and yet I'm very sad that we are the first, because it's pathetic, frankly, that in 2020, Cambridge, Massachusetts is the first city to do this. We have yet to see other cities follow it. Our next steps are to try to work with other cities to do this. We are working with some of the activists to try to see if we can get our state level legislators to have a similar mandate requirement for the same labels, a warning label across every single gas pump, at least in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Because again, does this matter? We have to do every single possible thing we can. So it all matters. Yes, it does matter. The more that we're reminded of this, the more that we cannot hide from the fact that both individual choices and the choices made by large companies which continue to provide these products literally are killing us. The greater that we have the urgency, we will feel the urgency and hopefully move towards more labels. I can't wait. I can't say our country would do it. Karolina, that's your country maybe, but I definitely think we can get our state to do it. And then hopefully with your talking to former Governor Schwarzenegger, we'll just have you call the current governor of California and have that happen as well. So again, all we can. I'm thrilled that all of you have led the charge internationally, and I am very happy to have played a very small part in elevating the voices of all the climate activists who encouraged our city to make this happen.
Thanks a lot, Patricia, and congratulations to your success in Cambridge. It's very inspiring to hear you, but as you said, it's quite discouraging that you're the only and the first city in the US and in the world, actually. I'm curious, your labels have been up for about 9 months, is that right? Have you heard or noticed any reactions from town residents about these labels since?
You know, that's a good question. When they first went up, we definitely heard some from residents, generally very positive. Some of the owners of the gas stations were not happy. They didn't understand why we were doing this. They, I think, feel a little threatened, and they should feel threatened. The reality is, in 10 years, if they don't change into a completely different business model, they will start to fade away and not be around. So I understand why they would feel threatened. And I individually went after it happened and talked to several of the owners of gas stations. And while they don't agree with me, they have to admit this is something they are going to have to deal with. And at least in those instances, I think there was a reluctant admission that, yes, we're moving in that direction. There were, I will say, a couple of residents who wrote to the council saying, why are you doing this? However, that was just a couple. And in general, it was a very positive response from people to say, yes, it is. We need to learn this. I think if we do it statewide, as I talked to a couple state legislatures, there will be more pushback from other people about why we really need to do this. And I have used the analogy to say the science is so clear. There is no way that you can deny that science now, especially with the latest IPCC report. And I think that will help us move this along at the state level to just do every little bit we can to get this done.
That is interesting and encouraging. You spoke in the beginning of your presentation about early initiatives in California, Berkeley, and maybe some more cities. Have you talked with the campaigner Jamie Brooks from the NGO Think Beyond the Pump recently, if there are anything moving again in California?
He is indefatigable, and he's trying, and he keeps bringing it up in those places. And my understanding is, unlike because we had this legal opinion that said we can move forward, they have run into, I don't understand the full roadblocks. I am sure that he is probably listening to this, and he will probably take it as more energized if he needs that. What I do know, he's also done some studies of what is the impact of this, and finding that people do remember it. It does have an impact, and I believe using that to bring back to Berkeley, to Seattle, to Vancouver, to say, all right, we now have evidence that this does have an impact. People remember it, and it has that little bit of consumer education. Again, if this is consumer education, nobody should be against it. That doesn't mean they won't be, but nobody should be. So you're right. Jamie Brooks he was the one, I believe, who brought it to the council in the first place, and he has certainly pushed me and pushed others, and he's working with us to try to see if we can get a state level initiative passed. In California, when I reached out, I did reach out to a couple people I know in Portland, Oregon, and others, and I think they'll work on it. The problem is it's not at the top of anybody's list. I think that's part of it. You need someone to take it. There's so many climate initiatives people are working on. It's hard to get this to be the one that I will spend the hours it takes to get past, is my understanding.
I see. So thanks a lot again, Patricia. So now let's cross the Atlantic and go to Great Britain. We are proud and grateful to have with us today Mike Gill and Sir Andy Haines. And Mike is former Regional Director of Public Health in South East England, and he has also been co-chair of the Climate and Health Council. And Andy, he is Professor of Environmental Change and Public Health, and also former Director of London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And among his many assignments, he has been member of the Working Group 2 of IPCC, and also review editor of the Health Chapter in its 5th assessment report. And Andy and Mike were among the signers of an opinion piece last April in the journal formerly called British Medical Journal, I think now just BMG. And the title was, We Need Health Warning Labels on Points of Sale of Fossil Fuels. And we are very curious to hear about your efforts and your thoughts about what should be done in Great Britain. Andy and Mike, I give the floor to you.
Thank you so much for inviting us to speak, and it's a great pleasure and a privilege for us to be here today and to learn from what you're doing. And Mike and Lorraine, both co-authors of that brief paper, are going to speak in just a moment from their own perspectives. But let me just say a few words about our reasoning behind the comment piece, and the fact that we saw health as a really important leverage, a really important fulcrum for getting change in perceptions around fossil fuel use. And of course, we were writing at the time when COVID was really emerging as a really major public health issue. So the focus of the public was much more on public health, the impacts of changes in the environment, changes in the transmission of infectious diseases on their health and the health of their loved ones. So you could argue that although it was a very worrying moment, it's also a kind of a propitious moment, potentially a moment where you could get more impact by emphasizing the public health message. Now, there are two broad arguments for linking climate change to public health. One is that climate change is having effects on health now and will increasingly have adverse effects in the future. And these effects can be classified into very direct effects like extreme heat. And a paper just a few weeks ago from some of my colleagues at the London School and others has shown that about 30% or more of the heat-related deaths over the last few decades can be attributed to climate change. In other words, they wouldn't have occurred in the absence of climate change. So there are now robust statistical techniques for enabling us to make these kind of statements. The second type of effects on human health of climate change are those mediated through ecosystems. So, for example, changes in transmission of infectious diseases, dengue, malaria, West Nile virus and others, or the effects of crop yields on nutrition. So declining crop yields, declining nutritional quality of crops can also obviously affect nutrition in many parts of the world, particularly in lower middle income countries, but not exclusively. My own country, for example, is increasingly importing fruit and vegetables from climate vulnerable countries. So in the future, possibly, the inhabitants of the UK might also be experiencing some of these adverse effects on nutrition. We know that fruit and vegetables are so important for public health. And the third category really is these indirect effects mediated through social and economic systems. So increasing poverty, because people can't work as much or their crops fail, potentially conflict, and population displacement, migration as well. So these are all reasons why we should be concerned that climate change is affecting our health now and in the future. But there's another additional reason, and that is that when we burn fossil fuels right now, it causes adverse effects on our health, and that's through air pollution, of course. Now, air pollution is very interesting scientifically. When I was very, very young, I was trapped in the London smog. Some of you remember the kind of historical smogs. It was like being trapped in a kind of acid fog. I remember as a very small child walking along the road and having to breathe this stuff and feeling, even in my very early childhood, this must be doing me some harm. But we got complacent because the air appeared clearer for many, many years. But now we know that even very low levels of air pollution have pervasive effects on our health. Fine particles, PM2.5s, that are 1/40th of the diameter of a human hair, can get deep into our lungs, and also these ultrafine particles can circulate in our bloodstreams and damage many organs. And we think that about 3.5 million people a year, premature deaths a year, can be related to the air pollution from burning fossil fuels. So those are compelling reasons to say that burning fossil fuels is a major public health threat. And the pioneering work that Patricia has been leading on, that you've been leading on in Sweden, I think really capitalizes on some of those linkages that we're becoming more and more aware of. So our proposal was that labels which would embody both health warning messages but also simple graphics demonstrating greenhouse gas emissions would together have some impact on behavior. And we know that, of course, there's no single way of influencing human behavior. You need to have multiple approaches. But nevertheless, and Lorraine will talk about that in just a moment, but nevertheless, we believe that foregrounding, emphasizing the effects on health can help to amplify the message. So very, very briefly, in concluding, what sort of impact did we have? Well, the BMJ is widely read, and we have had some feedback. We were contacted by Jamie, who has been, as we've already heard, a really important mover and shaker in this area. But these things take time. They take time to change. And we'll hear from Mike in just a moment the kind of reception we've been getting and the work that we've been doing. But we do think that the opportunity is really right now, particularly in the run-up to COP26. Just before this meeting, just as I was coming on, I had an email from a colleague, a medical colleague, saying that there was some good news from Glasgow, and I'll leave Mike to mention what that might be. It's an early stage, it's not definitive, but it does suggest that local governments around the UK are beginning to react. National government obviously dragging some way behind, but we think that local governments, and perhaps some enlightened private sector interests as well, can help to advance this agenda. So I'll stop there and hand over to my colleague Mike and Lorraine, of course. You need to unmute yourself, Mike. It's at the bottom of the screen.
There we are. Sorry that took some time. And thank you, Andy. But thank you particularly to Karolina and Per for including us. It's a delight to be here. And congratulations to Sweden and to Cambridge for what you've managed to achieve. It's been very much an inspiration for us. There have been one or two comments made about timing so far, and particularly the British participants in this webinar will sense the bitter irony of having a a webinar about labels on fuel pumps right now, because we've taken a rather radical step of covering most of our pumps with an even more clear message: sorry, fuel pump out of use altogether. I don't think that's going to work quite, but anyhow, I wanted to say a little bit about what's going on at government level, at local government level, and also a little bit about what's going on with private companies, supermarkets in particular. When we published, the timing was quite good in the sense that very shortly after that, the Department for Transport published its consultation paper called Decarbonising Transport, which was full of some good ideas, was full of really welcome acknowledgement about where they would welcome some help in the consultation process. And we, of course, popped up and bunged in our ideas and said, yeah, we're absolutely dying to help. I'm afraid nothing more than an acknowledgement followed that, and we weren't actually included directly in very much of the process. That led to a much longer document that came out in July of this year, which is called Decarbonising Transport, a Better and Greener Transport System. And it's very, very impressive in all sorts of ways, not least its length. It's about 220 pages. But also, in this version, it doesn't mention fuel labels, and it doesn't mention health warnings on fuel pumps. It doesn't mention health warnings on fuel pumps, but it does mention health, actually about 44 times, including often in the lists of references, which is actually very encouraging. And there's a very impressive, I think, demonstration of what you can do if you really produce a comprehensive plan of this sort across government. But I think nevertheless, a bit of the surprise about not taking our ideas up is revealed, and I'm just about to give you two quotes that it may well be that Lorraine will be speaking a little bit more about. They themselves demonstrated that they understood the behavioural change dimension as being absolutely crucial here. They quoted our own climate change committee, who say that 59% of emission reductions to reach net zero will involve some form of societal behaviour change. And their own research, they quote, saying there are multiple opportunities to change travel behaviour, but travel decisions are driven primarily by cost and convenience, not environmental concerns. Well, that may be true, but we can make the environmental concerns, which you're so ably magnifying, even stronger, perhaps by including in them some of the health concerns. Anyhow, there's everything to play for there. I think the strategy itself, I'm sure, will get lots more refinement. There's a real fear that it does little to prevent the notion of gridlock from electric vehicles. In other words, although it prioritises a modal shift to active and public transport, actually it remains possible that we will see a growth in the numbers of cars on the road, not a reduction, whether they're electric or anything else. And that's clearly not what anybody wants. And there's a whole absence of really proper thinking about, distance-based road pricing and all that kind of stuff that may make a big difference. So this is the kind of context into which one tiny, rather micro intervention you might perhaps describe health warnings on, or any warnings on fuel pumps as, is being put. But I'm sure, nevertheless, it's a very important one. Local government is a very interesting area because in the UK, I think since 1998, local governments have been required to produce local transport plans. And they do almost certainly have the capacity within the bylaw structure to, for example, mandate the kinds of labels that we're talking about today. We published, as we've said, just at the beginning of the pandemic. Actually, the paper came out, I think, in the end of March. And although previous conversations with local government chief execs have been jolly encouraging, they were immediately on such an enormous stretch trying to cope with all the other things associated with the pandemic that this has felt, I think, too small an issue. We're therefore particularly encouraged that in Glasgow, The pressure is being kept up locally. They've obviously got one or two local champions, and I think we're quite optimistic that things will start to move there. Finally, it turns out that a majority of the fuel in fuel stations sold in the UK is sold in fuel stations belonging to supermarkets, which makes it particularly important that if there's a supermarket chain, one might be able to kind of target them in a way that turns out to be rather effective. And there are one or two supermarket chains that have a very well-developed corporate social responsibility in the UK. And we've been in discussion with one, and initially I think we're quite encouraged by the kind of response that we were getting. But they have slightly gone back into their burrow because they say, actually, we don't want to do a kind of one-off isolated intervention of this sort. We want to think more comprehensively across the piece about eco-labels. We've retorted, so far entirely without effect, that, well, actually the fuel thing is a bit different, particularly because of the scale and pace of behavioural change that we're now trying to introduce, and we need to do everything we can. And the Swiss cheese model of all sorts of interventions to try and change behaviour rather than just one, of course applies, but it applies specifically in the whole area of behaviour change in relation to what kind of transport you go for. So I think we'll have to watch that space. Government, very encouraging paper. Local government, just the beginnings of glimmers of light. Supermarkets, no real progress, but dialogue started. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Andy and Mike. And it seems very wise, as you emphasize, Andy, about the health aspect of warning labels. And very encouraging to hear about activity in Glasgow. So let's hope they are inspiring, and maybe someone from Glasgow is listening and is inspired by Patricia in Cambridge, and maybe from Sweden as well. I have one question. Both Karolina and Patricia spoke about the importance of the activists and NGOs. Is there any activity from that sector in Great Britain encouraging these measures? Yes.
Shall I go first, Andy? Extinction Rebellion has been extremely supportive, and there's a Doctors for Extinction Rebellion kind of subgroup, and we've been working very closely with them. And it's they who took the initiative in relation to setting up discussions with one of the supermarket chains, and who's been negotiating with local authorities. So yes, the coalition is beginning to build in exactly the way that Andy, I think, and I both dreamt right in the beginning.
Do you want to add something, Andy?
Yeah, well, we're still at the fairly early stages, but I think what we're seeing also is that the health professionals around the world are becoming really engaged in the climate change arena. So, for example, we've seen representatives of over 40 million health professionals wrote to the heads of the G20, urging them to make sure that as they came out of COVID, they did so on a low carbon trajectory. That was something that would never have happened a few years ago. This is really a step change in the involvement of health professional organizations, not just activist organizations, but mainstream professional groups. In the US, we're seeing the National Academy of Medicine taking up the whole issue of climate change and health and promoting zero carbon healthcare delivery systems, which will be a tremendous lever really to change in so many sectors of society, because so many of the carbon emissions of the healthcare system are embedded in the supply chains, in pharmaceuticals, in medical equipment, and so on. And of course, part of that is also the transport system that brings many of these products to the healthcare delivery system. So I do think there's an opportunity to engage health professionals much more actively in this area. And we are seeing a lot more active participation of health professional organizations, as I say, not just at the activist end of the spectrum, but also very much at the kind of professional standards and specific specialty societies and so on. So it's a good time, I think, to perhaps re-engage with them. I'll actually be meeting one of the editors of a major medical journal this week, and I shall be urging her to carry forward this message and amplify it. And we'll see where it gets to. But I think we're at a very important inflection point in human history. And I think the health professionals, the health professions as a whole, are really seeing the rapidly emerging climate catastrophe that is coming over the horizon at us very, very quickly, and are increasingly energized and actively engaged in trying to avert potential disaster. So it's a good time, I think, to engage professionals in this kind of work.
Thanks a lot, Andy and Mike, again. So we now turn to the potential impact of climate change labels. And this following discussion may give fuel to the panel later on. And first, I am happy to introduce my colleague and boss, Marie Pellas, who is president of the Swedish Association of Green Motorists. And Marie is a former mobility planner at the city of Västerås. And she is currently a climate strategist at the large technical consultant firm AFRI. Please go ahead, Marie.
Thank you. Hi. I will start sharing my screen. Hopefully it will work. Yes? Don't see you. If I don't hear you, I will take it as a yes, it works. Well, hello. My name is Marie Pellas. I am president, chairman, don't know, of the Swedish Association of Green Motorists, Gröna Bilister. For the green motorists, labeling fuel pumps is a huge win, as we have been campaigning for this since the spring of 2013. I am really happy that eco-labeling is in place in Sweden and hope to see more of this worldwide. I would like to start with a question that some of you may be thinking of. What could be the effects of eco-labeling? Will it contribute to more sustainable fuels and to sustainable mobility in a wider sense? The answer lies in the future, but here are some hints. And the hints are affirmative. However, we must remember that at best, this is a valuable but small tool among many to speed up the transition to sustainable mobility. The first encouraging sign we noted as we started our campaign was that we got opposition. Resistance from the large fuel companies means they feared the effects. If they thought eco-labels had no substantial effect, they wouldn't care. Conversely, we got support from smaller companies specializing in renewable fuels, charging stations, or hydrogen. This points in the same direction. The large fuel companies and their trade organizations opposed labels on pumps much more than information on the web, suggesting labels are crucial for impact. In public, they opposed eco-labels with some reasonable arguments and some silly ones. They argued, for example, that it would be very expensive and laborsome to put stickers on the pumps once a year, that there was no place on the pumps for these stickers, and, quite a favorite of mine, that the glue didn't work in winter, so the labels would fall off. In private, we got some one-liners like these. No, in private, we got some one-liners like these. Sorry, the labels will affect the market, but in a distorted way. You are so irritating. You have no idea what it's like to run a large fuel company. Now let's see if we are on track. Yes. The Green Motorists commissioned 2 opinion polls, one in 2014 and one in 2016, to estimate the public's interest in eco-labels and whether they would affect the choice of fuel. The results were quite encouraging, but not overly so. 41% thought it was important to get information at the pump about climate impact and origin. 29% thought not. 72% choose fuel based on country of origin if they had the information. 23% would not. On the more theoretical side, we envision several potential consumer effects. A crucial point is that eco-labels on the pump pair together abstract threats like climate change to a personal choice, and to the physical action to fill a car. This may trigger behavioral changes. This insight is possibly the reason why large fuel companies resisted labels much more than giving the same information on the web. Possible consumer effects are choosing an alternative fuel rather than a fossil fuel if your car allows it, selecting a fuel retailer with better sustainability data, deciding to buy an electric car next time, driving less often, and putting pressure on those in power, demanding reforms for sustainable mobility. We also envision some effects on the retailer side of the coin. It is clear that disclosure of standardized and validated data makes it possible to compete with sustainability in a fair manner. Regulations often force alternative fuels into the market. Sustainability competition may boost these fuels, reducing greenhouse gas emission faster than required. Retailer will think twice before introduce questionable raw materials from questionable countries, since they have to disclose them later on. There is a similar labeling system that has been in place for almost 30 years, and that's the European energy label on fridges, TV sets, and other appliances. Evaluation of these labels reveal considerable effects, which may translate to future effects on eco-labels on fuel pumps. The energy labels have triggered innovation towards energy efficiency. Energy savings, thanks to the labels together with Eco-Design Directive, are estimated to 18% in 2020 and 30% in 2030 compared to business as usual. The share of Swedish buyers that let labels affect their choice ranges from 64% with appliances to 23% with tires. There's another case where labels have had considerable effects on market, and that's organic food. The market share of organic food has risen drastically in most Western countries. Denmark has the world's highest share with 12% in 2019. The rise is driven by personal choice, made possible by trustworthy labeling. Here we see the EU organic label and the Swedish Krav label. It adds more animal welfare criteria than the European label. Organic food is more expensive than ordinary food. The success of organic food thus proves that perceived benefits for environment and health can outweigh higher prices. This may apply to sustainable fuels as well, now that they are labeled properly. We recommend reading this new academic paper, Climate Change Warning Labels on Gas Pumps, the role of public opinion formation in climate change mitigation policies. The paper analyzes potential effects on climate change warning labels on gas pumps. One of the conclusions is encouraging. The analysis reveals warning labels may activate extant climate concern norms and shift public opinion toward long-term support of sustainable transportation emissions policies and practices. We are convinced that knowledge matters. Consumer power matters. We often hear that that it is the responsibility of those in power to combat climate change, not the individual. But we cannot speak of personal responsibility as opposed to political responsibility. The one facilitates the other. Thank you for listening.
And thank you, Marie, above all. So we are a little bit short of time, so I think we move promptly to our next and also the final speaker, which is Lorraine Whitmosh. And Lorraine, you are a professor of environmental psychology at the University of Bath, and also director of CAST, which is an acronym for Center for Climate Change and Social Transformations. And among many assignments, you are lead author for the IPCC in Working Group 2. And you, Lorraine, will discuss whether labels can change perceptions and behavior. So, without further ado, I give the floor to you, Lorraine, please.
Thank you very much, Per. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you. And like others, very excited about this initiative that is launching in Sweden. So congratulations. I have a few slides, so hopefully I can just show you those quickly. So hopefully you can see those. And I wanted to kind of look at the role of labels in the context of other things that we need to do to change perceptions and behavior in relation to climate change. It's clear that the behavior change is essential for tackling climate change. We know that probably over half of the measures that we need to reach our net zero targets will involve behavior change. And this figure shows the most effective things that we can do as individuals to reduce our carbon footprint. And you can see actually that several of them, in fact, the top few are transport related. So actually changing our travel behaviors is amongst the most impactful things that we can do to help tackle climate change, including living car free, but also changing the type of vehicle that we drive. The good news is that polls from around the world show that people are concerned about climate change, and actually they do think that they have a responsibility to change their behavior. So this comes from some polling that Ipsos Mori did quite recently, and you can see that on average across a whole range of countries, around nearly 3/4 of the public agree that if individuals like me do not act now to combat climate change, we will be failing future generations. But behavior change does tend to lag. So while people say they're concerned, actually their behavior change is not as significant yet as it needs to be. So we do need to change behavior. And how can we do that? Well, we broadly speaking categorize interventions to change behavior into downstream measures. And here, this is broadly speaking information in general. So things like eco-labels would definitely come under this category. This is where we're directly influencing individuals' choices, their decision-making about whether to choose one thing over another. But upstream measures are where we're trying to influence the context in which people are acting. And so, for example, making certain products cheaper, others more expensive, maybe changing the availability of products through regulation or through the way in which they might be arranged within canteens here or supermarkets and elsewhere. And of course, changes to the built environment. So actually, transport infrastructure changes and the way in which we design cities to potentially accommodate low travel modes, low carbon modes over high carbon modes. So these upstream measures are also important along with downstream. Actually, we need both downstream and upstream measures. Downstream informational measures are important because we know actually there are knowledge gaps. People don't necessarily know what are the most effective things that they can do to tackle climate change. And so we can help address those gaps. And we've heard about various different kind of labelling schemes in the UK. Also, many supermarkets are about to trial climate labels on ranges of products. So labelling, eco-labelling and climate labelling specifically is being expanded in a number of areas. We know, though, that communication is most effective when it targets what people care about. And as Andy and Mike have talked about, health, of course, is something which generally people are concerned about. And many people might be more concerned about their health than they are about the environment. So it can be an important way of resonating with those values, the things that people care about. But equally, saving money and time, maybe helping community, family, those things are other things that people care about. So the more we can align messaging with those values, the more we can encourage people to act. The source of information is important as well. So we need to have trusted messengers. And as we've heard, the information that is being used in these new labels is trusted. It's robust information and it's coming from trusted sources. But also the time and place is really important. As we've already heard, putting a label on a fuel tank is the moment at which you are making a decision about which how to fill your car, as opposed to something on a website at a different time when you're not actually filling up your car. So it's important to have it in the same way that we have maybe stickers next to light switches at the point at which you're about to switch off the light. Remember to do that. So have it where you're taking the action is really important. But there are limits to what information can do, and that's partly because information is filtered through biases. So we don't all see information in the same way. And actually, this is why it is important to align information with what people care about. So actually talking in terms that align with values, for example, health or family or money, is really important to get people's attentions, and then they will potentially act on that. But another barrier to information use is habit. And we know that habit can mean that actually you don't pay attention to information. So because you're just acting on autopilot, you're kind of a robot almost in some situations. And travel is actually one of those situations. You often are sort of not really necessarily thinking, how am I going to get to work? You use the same mode that you always do. Maybe at the fuel station, you're not necessarily paying attention. So it can limit what information can do. But there are times at which information is more salient in decision making, and actually targeting those times, for example, when people move house or start a new job, those can be really important opportunities to be much more effective in shaping people's travel behaviour. Final point really is just to say, as others have said, information alone is not usually very effective in changing behaviour. By itself, things like labels and informational approaches can maybe change behaviour in terms of a few % change. But actually, when it's added to other measures, it can be very powerful. So actually adding in incentives or regulations or social approaches, other additional things, that's when you start to see much, much more behaviour change following. And so without going into all of these examples, but you can see changes of up to 80% or even 100% in some cases of people changing their behaviour when information is combined with other sorts of measures, not least in the case of transport, changing the design of cities to, for example, allow more space for cyclists and pedestrians. So to conclude, behaviour change is essential for tackling climate change. We do need more than just information, but information is effective when it targets values, for example, could be health or financial considerations, when it's timely at the point of action, for example, and when habits are weaker, when it's coming from trusted sources, and when it's combined with upstream measures like economic or regulatory measures. So I think climate change labels are a really important signal that things are starting to change. So I think that they are extremely significant, but they do need to be part of an additional set of measures that make it easier, cheaper, more normal and attractive for people to act. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Lorraine. I learned a lot in 10 minutes. So one quick question. I noted that you spoke about the importance of timing, and you should target people when habits are weak at moments of change. Do you think now is the time? Is this a time of change?
That's a great question. We've actually been tracking people's habits during COVID and as restrictions have lifted. And yeah, I do think that this has been a really important, significant period of change. A lot of people have been using more active modes, at least in the UK, obviously, and beyond, where further travel has, car travel hasn't been possible in some cases. And obviously aviation, people are not flying so much. And of course, we now have huge innovation like being able to do online webinars like this. And this is becoming much more normal. So I think things are starting to significantly change because we've been exposed to alternatives and because we've tried them out. And so I think it's absolutely about locking in these experiences that people have had recently. And for example, employers encouraging people to replace business travel by online interaction, and city councils, for example, closing off roads and saying this is for cyclists and pedestrians, we're having less parking available, etc. So really encouraging people to continue active travel.
Interesting to hear, Lorraine. So by that, all the speakers have spoken. And when you have something interesting to speak about and discuss, time flies. So the panel discussion that was planned for at least 20 minutes is now down to 5 or maybe 7 minutes. So I have prepared many interesting questions for you, but I will just have time for 1 or 2. So I want to hear your opinions about this. Pictures can evoke stronger reactions than texts. And the climate impact rating on the Swedish eco-label is a simple graphic message. And I want to mention another campaigner, Robert Shirky in Canada, who directs the NGO Our Horizon. He promoted warning labels on gas pumps for many years. And they are very emotional. They suggest a picture with a reindeer or a coral reef or a crying child. Do you think that such graphic messages and pictures are important or even essential for the impact of labels?
I'll jump in quickly. They would not have passed our legal muster because it needed to be very specific, not assailable information, because we're giving consumer information. And what I would leave it to is psychologists and marketing experts to say, would that kind of picture have more of an impact or not? Because I would love to know, and if so, I would certainly push if we could do more of it. But we had considered some visuals on our label, and we were told we're just sticking with text that was very clear and specific to the point raised.
Lorraine.
Oh, maybe Mike was going to say something similar, but I think in terms of things like, I was thinking of on the cigarette packets, we've had lots of very, very, very graphic images there of diseased lungs and things, and that has been found to have an effect. So I think potentially, yes, if you get the image right and it is something that people care about, and whether that be something health related or it could be your example of like a child or something, actually these are things that are going to be really impacting people that we care about, people in our community, our own children. I think that can really bring it home for people and make people care, yeah.
Oh, Mike, you wanted to say? Okay. So anybody else wanted to add something?
Well, I can just fill in that I did my master with behavioral, how to change the behavior, how to drive less car, and the results, though a master, was that women with children would act more on this sort of information than men without children. Images and information, yeah.
Interesting.
So I think that was the very short panel discussion, because our time was set for 1 hour and 20 minutes. And I'm sure this conversation will continue and intensify and be followed by more action. And by that, I give the floor back to Karolina Skog to say some final words.
And I firstly want to thank all the participants for very, very interesting words to us and good speeches. And the lesson that I take from this are several. One is how important it is to find collaborations between activists and politicians, to work together and make things happen. And the other, of course, to reach out to people's heart and find what really matters to them when doing this: health, children, the future. And when you do those things together, you can really make things happen. And as always, timing is important. Timing is important when you want to change people. Timing is very important in politics. I think the example of these labels in Sweden was very much a matter of timing. It fitted, it made sense in the political sense at a specific time, together with other legal changes. Again, I do hope that the idea of labels will spread to other cities, to other countries, and I would be very curious to see different shapes of labels, what kind of information will be crucial to put onto them, and to get more consumers more active, give them choice, and get this feeling that you can really change. You can do something to lessen your own climate impact and do things together with others, because that's the key to change. Thank you.